Directory authentication works. My name is Brian Reid, and I work for a Microsoft partner called MB Consult. I'm the director of it in the UK with offices in Cape Town and Hong Kong. And what we're going to look at today is, let me move on a couple of slides. What we're going to look at today in this Cloudeight seminar is we're going to have a look. Try using the right screen. There we go. We're going to have a look at various things through Azure Active Directory. We're very grateful to Script Runner, the 365 blog, and IT Point Aria for their support of this Cloudeight virtual event. So thank you all for coming. And let's see. Azure Active Directory is vitally important underlying our cloud access. Okay, it's you could say it's the equivalent of our Office 3 of our Active Directory from 20 years ago and our authentication to that platform. For all our cloud services, we need an authentication platform there, and this is what Azure Active Directory is. From a user perspective, it's very short-lived in effect. They log on and then they carry on using their work. From an admin perspective, you're going to spend much more time in it. But we're going to have a look in this session as to what the different bits are, how it works behind the scenes, how the users get access to things like Teams, how you logged into this team session, how did that actually happen? You probably actually thinking about it, you probably didn't, it's a meeting, but in your normal day-to-day life, you access a team session, you access Exchange, SharePoint, and so on, and third-party IDP applications. And then from an administrative perspective, bring up the admin console, what the changes are and what you're doing with the changes and what all that means. Right? And so what's happening in the background is how we're going to start off. Then we're going to go and have a look at how we can troubleshoot that and fix the problems that arise as we, if issues arise, hopefully, of course, issues don't arise and it's completely seamless to the user. Okay. If you've got any questions, stick them in the chat, and we'll come back to them at the end. And if you, we'll open. You can unmute yourself at the end and ask questions as well, and that's probably the best way to do it. Okay. I'm going to use some drawing on the screen. I've got my pen, and so what we're going to do start off with is we're going to have a look at what's happening in Azure Active Directory when the user signs in. I've got the notes on the screen, and I'm going to do a little bit of drawing as well to help. So what is happening? Let's turn on a pen in PowerPoint for me. Swing that camera around there a little bit better. Let's see if that's working. And okay, right, for the recording. Okay, so let's do it from the assumption of our favorite application, Outlook. Okay, so we've got Outlook. Let's assume that we've never logged in before. It's an easy assumption because we normally are logged in and it just starts and it just works. So we're assuming from this case that we're not logged in at all. It's an anonymous session. Okay? Maybe this is Outlook for the web in a browser. That's a much easier place to be when you're not logged in. And we need to gain access. Okay? So the first thing we do, let's say it's the browser, and we go to outlook.office.com, and that takes us to Exchange Online. So, okay, and Exchange Online is like, well, I don't know who you are. Who are you? I need you to authenticate. Okay, it's an anonymous session, as we see on our first line here. So I tick by that one. It's an anonymous session. We hit the service endpoint that we're connecting to, and Exchange Online has a relationship with Azure Active Directory and says, Azure Active Directory is my identity platform. I'd like you to go to Azure Active Directory, please. So let's write in AAD here. That's Azure Active Directory. And via the browser, I'm redirected to Azure Active Directory. Okay, so it's a HTTPS session. It's a client session. It all routes via the client. Okay, the client is involved in the process. Okay, if this was out.
Brian, they don't see your Outlook now. They simply see what's happening right now.
Yeah, and I'm drawing on it.
Okay.
That's right. So O is Outlook. Here's Outlook. Yeah, I can't write on this screen. You can see my shared screen, can't you?
They can see still the slide from what is happening.
Yeah, that's right. And the pen.
And the pad, but there is no Outlook, nothing.
This is Outlook here.
Okay. Yes, this I can see.
Yeah, right.
Sorry for interrupting.
That's fine. Let me restart that and make that a bit clearer. Okay. So I've got Outlook. Here's Outlook. Okay. And I'm connecting to Exchange Online, EXO. Okay. And Exchange Online says it's an anonymous session. I need you to go to Azure Active Directory. So here's Azure Active Directory. Okay. And we go to Azure Active Directory via the client. Okay. So we go via Outlook. This red arrow here, it's a HTTPS session. And all the connectivity happens via, in this case, Outlook, the browser. But if this Outlook here, if this was a real-time client, a rich 32 client, desktop client, then that would be in the web control that pops up in front of the client, the login box that you would see. Okay, and so we've got all the bits in place. We connect to Azure Active Directory, and it's over Azure Active Directory that I'll present my username, okay, my password, and if I'm required to do any MFA or anything like that, then I'll provide the MFA at that point. Okay, just going to change my pen color for a second and add an additional piece to this. Let's say I had ADFS. Let's say I federated my Active Directory to AD. So I've set up my domain that says contoso.com, and contoso.com is federated to AD. So I have an AD down here at the bottom of the screen. And AD and ADFS have a relationship with each other. It's all set up when you set up ADFS. Okay, and the username is entered. So I say, let's say, Brian at contoso.com. I'm just going to write c.com. Okay, so I submit the username Brian at contoso.com to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory goes, contoso.com, that's managed by ADFS. I'm going to redirect the user to ADFS via the client. So the HTTPS session back to Outlook, the client, O on the left, down to ADFS. I'll see the ADFS login box at this point, and I'll enter my password and any MFA maybe that ADFS does at this point. Okay? And so in terms of where I am in the whole process, I'd be down here at ADFS, and I'd have presented my password to ADFS, and it will authenticate me to AD, and I'll be successful in that. We'll assume we get the right password at that point. And assuming that all that is successful, information is sent back to the client. This is going to be, let's call it token number 1. Okay. And token number 1 is sent back to the client, and the client submits token number 1 to Azure Active Directory. Okay. So Azure Active Directory has been given this information, and Azure Active Directory has token number 1, and Azure Active Directory has a relationship as well, just like the relationship that Azure Active Directory, that ADFS has with AD. Azure Active Directory has a relationship with ADFS, and so the token that I present to ADFS, the token that I present to Azure Active Directory is understood by Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory knows that I am Brian at contoso.com, and I successfully signed in. Okay, we just erase a little bit of that again, because this is going to get a chunk messy. Okay, and let's go back to the pen, and I'm just going to put myself back on red because we're back in ADFS. So we've got Outlook, okay, and we've successfully authenticated in Azure Active Directory. Okay. Azure Active Directory now needs to tell Exchange Online that this is Brian, that he's successful in his sign-in, and Brian can have access to his mailbox. Okay. And so we do this by the way of 2 tokens, token 1 and token 2. I'm going to call them. They're actually an access token. So let's call that token A for access, and token 2, a refresh token. Okay. So these two tokens are sent from Azure Active Directory back to Outlook. And of those, the access token, TA, is sent to Exchange Online. The refresh token is kept by, actually they're both kept by Outlook, but Outlook presents the access token to Exchange Online. Okay. Exchange Online, as we had with ADFS and so on, has a relationship with has a relationship with Azure Active Directory, and Exchange Online understands the tokens that are provided to it via the client, and is able to read the tokens and know that Azure Active Directory, whom it trusts, has said that this is really Brian, and because it's really Brian, and trust the user, and I'm going to let them to log in. And so Exchange Online will provide service for me. It'll send me my email, etc., and all the things that go with that. Okay? And so I'm able to do, for the next while, I'm able to communicate email between Outlook and Exchange Online. And the application works and data travels between the two applications. And in fact, every request that Outlook makes to Exchange Online, it will submit the token, the access token, to Exchange Online. Okay? So the Azure Active Directory bit of all this is actually quite small. It's at the beginning, it's based on that anonymous connection. I logged in, I was successful in logging in. And once I'd successfully logged in, the remainder of the traffic carries on between Exchange Online. I don't go back to Azure Active Directory very often. And if I was federated to ADFS, which I've now deleted from this slide, I go back to ADFS even less often than that. Okay, so the user is successfully authenticated. So put a tick in there. Okay, and as we say here, we've got lots of options on how that happens. So things like MFA and so on. Okay, and we've got this given two tokens. So we've covered that off in our list as well. Okay, and we've presented them. Okay. And so that's my authentication. A very quick process, job done. In fact, it would happen quicker than I'd taken to describe it. Okay. Later on, though, the token's going to expire. So here we are, quite happily, doing our communication between Outlook and Exchange Online. And as the communication goes on, the token hits the end of its life. So the access token has a lifetime, and the access token has a lifetime of 1 hour. Okay. So the hour comes by and Outlook sees that the token it's got is now out of date. Okay. Or Exchange Online is given a token by Outlook and Exchange Online says, no, that's out of date. I'm not going to accept it. So either side could reject the token and either side would say, okay, token's expired. I need to go and get another one. So let's change my ink color. Let's go yellow because I can see that on a dark background. Tokens expired, and so Outlook returns to Azure Active Directory. And with returning to Azure Active Directory, it sends back this time the refresh token that it cached in the client. Okay, the access token is expired. We don't need to worry about the access token anymore, but it sends back the refresh token to Azure Active Directory. Now, the refresh token has a 90-day expiry. Okay, and so it hasn't expired. Okay, it's now 89 days and 23 hours left on it because, of course, an hour has gone by since I got the refresh token as well. Okay, so my access token has expired, the hour is gone, but my refresh token, 89 plus days left on it. I present to Azure Active Directory the refresh token, and the refresh token has information in it. It basically says, an hour ago, you authenticated me, everything was good an hour ago. Please authenticate me again. Please provide for me another access token. Now, assuming everything in the refresh token is good, okay, nothing's changed with Outlook, nothing's changed with the user account, Azure Active Directory is still happy. Okay? If all that's still the case, okay, then Azure Active Directory will present back to Outlook token access. I'm going to call it token access number 2. It's another access token. Okay. And Outlook will present the access token. It's just called A2T. There we go, token access 2. And token access 2 is presented to Exchange Online and the communication continues. And that's an even shorter process than before. And that's completely invisible to the user. The user doesn't see any interruption in their mail flow. It doesn't see interruption in the Outlook client. They don't see a pop-up for authentication or anything like that. Okay? And so they keep the session going. Okay? Additional to all this, I get a new access token returned, access token, sorry, a new refresh token returned, refresh token 2 as well. Refresh token is valid for 90 days again. So I've got a new token, a new access token valid for an hour. I've got a new access token, sorry, a new refresh token valid for 90 days. And Outlook caches that information and carries on sending it. Okay. Now, let's say in the middle of all this, I decided that I wanted to connect to SharePoint. So I got the SharePoint service up here. Okay. Now, my access token for Exchange is not good enough for SharePoint. SharePoint won't accept my access token for Exchange. And so I will do exactly the same process I just did before. Okay. I will connect down to Exchange Online. So this time I'll go down to Azure, to Azure Active Directory. I'll present my refresh token and I'll get given and say, this time I'd like, please, a token for Exchange Online. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. A token for SharePoint Online. Okay. And so I will get given a token that gives me access to SharePoint Online. Okay. That's a single sign-on. Okay. The holder of the tokens, rather than being Outlook, because if it was Outlook, I couldn't, the SharePoint client couldn't get the refresh token. But if it was Windows, for example, holding the refresh token, then I could get the access token for SharePoint Online without needing to authenticate again. Okay. If I'm on a different machine, obviously I can't get the refresh token again. If I'm on if it's a different user, the refresh token is not valid either. There's lots of stuff going on, but if it's on the same machine, a SSO scenario in place, then I can use my refresh tokens and gain access to SharePoint Online. And with that request, I can keep logged into Exchange and keep logged into SharePoint Online. And so SharePoint Online, I have an access token for, and of course I have the refresh token for that, and that will all expire in an hour, independent of anything that I'm doing for Exchange Online. Okay. Go back to Reid. Okay. Later still, we've got our token expire, so we've done that one. Okay, and we get a new access token. But here's our last one on what happens in the background. Okay, something material changes with my user account. Okay, let's say that let's have a different color. Let's have light blue. That will work on a dark background. Let's say that my user account is synced into Azure Active Directory from Active Directory. Okay, it doesn't have to be. It could be a cloud account. Doesn't really matter for this case. But let's say my password changes. Okay. With my password change happening, synced up to the cloud is the last time of my password change as well. Okay. And Azure Active Directory uses that information about the last time of my password change to say, okay, right, this account is no longer valid. Okay. This account is not good anymore because the password's changed. We need the user to authenticate again. But I've got these valid tokens. I'm still happily talking to Exchange Online, and I'm still happily talking to SharePoint Online, and I'm not returning back to Azure Active Directory, who knows that my access token shouldn't be accepted anymore. Okay. So sometime within the next hour, though, my access tokens will expire. Okay. And let's put the laser pointer back on. So we're quite happily communicating here. We're quite happily communicating here. Tokens expire, or one of the tokens expire, and from the token expiring, I connect back to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory goes, oh, no, your password's changed. I need you to authenticate again. Okay. And with your authentication happening now again, or needing to happen again, it's basically expired the refresh token. So it'll say, okay, I don't trust the refresh token that you sent me, okay, and I need you to authenticate another time. And so later still, the user's account changes materially. Let's say the password changes, refresh token's now invalid, and we start the whole process again. Okay. Another example of a material change in all this might be the risk of the user account has changed, or the IP address of the account's changed. And so Azure Active Directory says, no, your refresh token's not good anymore, but I need your because your IP address has changed, I need you now to do some MFA because the client has moved to a different location or something like that. And so may only do some of the authentication rather than all of it. But once I complete the MFA challenge, maybe I was on a trusted network and now I'm on an untrusted network. Once I complete the MFA challenge, Azure Active Directory is happy, and Azure Active Directory will return me my refresh token and my new access token, which I can carry on sending to my service, and my service can continue. So at this point, I will see a pop-up, and I will be interrupted. But the general idea is that while I have no material changes to my account, the process will continue all of the time. And so if I'm in that bracket there, for example, and that bit there later, the hour, okay, then I will keep repeating around this cycle, maybe infinitely. Let's try and do it. I can't really do infinite. Let's try and erase that and try that again. Infinite, there we go. In theory, I could keep repeating that process infinitely as long as my token doesn't have a material change to the token and I stay signed in. Okay. What happens when it breaks? Okay, because it does break. Okay, it could break for a number of different reasons. Okay, let's carry on with our drawing. We've got Outlook. Right up, that's dreadful. Anyway, let's write up Outlook, and we got Outlook working. We're going to ignore Exchange Online for this bit. We're just going to connect now down to Azure Active Directory. Okay, we're quite happily doing Exchange up here, and then the tokens expire. So we're at Outlook. We're going to go and connect from Outlook to Azure Active Directory, but something's wrong with the network. Let's say I can't connect. Well, then, and in this case, let's say I was able to connect to Exchange Online fine, but I'm unable to connect to Azure Active Directory. DNS. We always know the issue is DNS, DNS or networks, and we can't reach Azure Active Directory. Maybe, let's say, I've got a VPN client running, and the VPN client routes me down to on-prem, and I'm not doing split tunneling or anything like that. And on-prem is my route to Azure Active Directory. I'm not recommending this at all, but let's say that's the scenario that I'm in, and something's gone wrong on-prem. Okay, or I have a cloud proxy or an on-prem proxy or an on-prem network. The issue could be anywhere. Okay, and I can't reach Azure Active Directory for some reason. Okay, my token's expired. I can't get back to Azure Active Directory, and because I can't get back to Azure Active Directory, I can't refresh my tokens. Because I can't refresh my tokens, I lose access to my service. Okay, that won't happen immediately, okay, but it will happen within the hour, just like the password change. It will happen within the hour. And so if an outage happened and then the outage went away, put that back, in less time, or here, let's take that out, okay, and I wasn't going via VPN, I was going direct, let's say, okay, so the outage happens and the outage goes away, but it's outside of the time window in which I need to connect to Azure Active Directory, I won't notice. So let's say there was an interruption on my proxy at my customer. So let's say I'm routing via the VPN and proxy at my company. Someone made a misconfiguration and the proxy was blocking Azure Active Directory, something like that. Because I'm still happily here connecting to Exchange Online and don't need to connect to Azure Active Directory until the hour has expired, when I try and connect to Azure Active Directory, I'm successful. Okay, so if I have an outage outside of that window, I'm great. But if I have an outage and it's inside the window that I need to connect, okay, then I will notice the issue. Okay, Microsoft set the token lifetimes to an hour for good practice. You don't want to connect to Azure Active Directory too often. That would be more impactful. It would certainly cause more network traffic to them, and a larger service would be needed. They don't want to connect you to Azure Active Directory any less frequently, because that means material changes to your account take longer to be noticed. For example, your password change, or the risk of your account, or the changed IP, you won't see the effect of that for a longer period of time. So Microsoft set the token expiry, the token lifetime, to 1 hour, so that you come back in what they consider to be a sensible amount of time. Okay? And there is the option to change token lengths, and that used to exist a couple of years ago. There was a way of doing that, and now there's a way of changing token lengths in conditional access. Okay? So you can reduce token lengths maybe for some applications. Okay. And so they're the pieces that are available to us. Obviously, we don't want to be going VPN, on-prem, cloud proxy, etc. Other things that can cause a network issue. Okay, but there could be, and there was about 4 weeks ago, wasn't there? Microsoft had an outage, and the whole of Azure Active Directory went offline. Okay, and it went offline for about 4 hours. Now it was US hours, and so it affected. It was end of day New York time, so it affected East and West Coast US, and it affected the Far East. It didn't affect Europe so much, even though it was a global outage, because it was overnight for us here in Europe. So I woke up the next morning, Twitter was full of Azure Active Directory issues, and for me it was great. I didn't notice. That's not to say it won't happen in the future, but there was an issue with Azure Active Directory, and it was a 4-hour issue. It was greater than my token refresh period. Okay. So what are Microsoft doing about things like this? Well, they've introduced, and you can turn this on, it's in preview, but you can turn this on, and this preview is called Continuous Access Evaluation. And what Continuous Access Evaluation does, let's delete some of the stuff that's going on down there. Continuous Access Evaluation does a token length, so T access, rather than it being 1 hour, is 28 hours. Okay. And the idea of continuous access evaluation is, let's put Exchange Online back up here as well, is rather than what we had before, which is Outlook talking to Exchange Online and Outlook or Exchange rejecting the token when it expires, in which case it's 28 hours, that would be quite a gap. The scenario that falls into this, let's make Azure Active Directory work again. The scenario here is if something changes to my account, okay, Azure Active Directory can tell Exchange Online a change has occurred, okay, within the 28 hours. And Exchange Online can reject the token, although it hasn't yet expired. Okay. And so we could quite happily be having our process, we're connecting, we're sending the token up, we're authenticating with Exchange Online, we're good on all the connectivity that's happening here. Our token is valid, Exchange Online accept our token. There's 27, 26, 25 hours left, and my password changes. Okay. So I have a password change, for example, at 25 hours into the token. Information is sent up to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online rejects the token. No, token rejected, back down to Azure Active Directory and get a new token. Okay. But in this scenario, we're only going to visit, assuming no material changes to my account, we're going to assume that we only visit Azure Active Directory every 28 hours. Okay. Things like risk change and change of IP address by the client, these are all things that would cause the token to expire. Okay. Now, this is all available for Exchange Online at the moment and for SharePoint Online at the moment. Some early documentation on this said it was available to Teams as well. The wording of Teams disappeared in the most recent documentation. I'm going to write Teams in here as well. It'll come back if it's not working with it already. And then the idea is that at some point in the future, this will work for other services and maybe the third-party services that you can authenticate via Azure Active Directory. And you'll be able to do a much less frequent visit to Azure Active Directory because the service will kick you out and send you back to Azure Active Directory when your token expires on a material change in the token or material change in the account rather than every hour. And if we go back, let's say 4 weeks and the Azure AD outage in the US, if you had continuous access evaluation enabled at that time, it was available at that time, but if you had continuous access evaluation enabled at that time, then you probably wouldn't have noticed an outage, okay? Because you probably wouldn't have visited Azure Active Directory within that 4-hour outage window, because the 4-hour outage window was smaller than the 28-hour validity of your token. Other things, of course, that can break in all this is going to be down to your connectivity and this, that, and the other. But in terms of token lengths and Azure Active Directory being up and running, continuous active evaluation will give us much longer token lengths and will give us a much better response to the service. So from the end user's experience, what do they see in all this? Well, hopefully as little as possible. Okay, they're going to see a login page, and then hopefully not going to see a login page after that again. Okay, other things they could see are things like company branding that you might have available. So we'll talk about turning some of these options on so we can customize the experience. They may see requests for multi-factor authentication. They may see registration for things like self-service password reset while they're signing in. They may see security defaults settings, and so registration of MFA and password reset. Okay. They may also see consent requests, the request to allow them to make use of an application that wants to read their data. Okay. And we'll have a look at some of those in a moment. But they're the sort of things the user could experience when looking at Azure Active Directory. And we'll see how we configure those in a moment. From the perspective of improving security with Azure Active Directory, what can we do to make security better? Okay. Well, if we authenticate less often, remember we're authenticating all the time. Every single packet that I sent to Exchange Online is authenticated. It's authenticated with these tokens are issued by Azure Active Directory, and they're trusted by the service, Exchange, SharePoint, and so on. So we're authenticated on every packet. We just don't need to see that authentication in face of the user, a pop-up dialog box or whatever. Okay. For example, we could quite easily see a pop-up box every hour for every service. That would get very much in the way of our productivity, and it would annoy the user. And also, if we keep seeing these pop-up boxes and keep having to enter our credentials, then when a phisher tries to get our credentials and presents us with a dialog box, we're going to enter the details into that as well. So if we can never see a prompt for a password, then we're much less likely to enter our details into a password prompt. Okay. And that can help the security of the system as well. So things like MFA every day, or 90-day password resets, or 60 or 30-day password resets, they're all going to cause upfront in the user's face a request to authenticate, and therefore actually have a material disadvantage to the security of my system rather than a material improvement to my system. Okay. We're going to see token invalidation at things like risk change. That's good. You know, my account risk changes. I start connecting from a machine with malware on it, and Microsoft knows that endpoint is a malware generating endpoint, and so my risk goes high, and so my account changes there. Okay. Or I have, we said earlier, IP address change. I move to a less trusted network. Of course, if you consider zero trust and you don't trust any network at all, I would go to I would have MFA on every network, and therefore I'm not going to go somewhere and sometimes be prompted for MFA and some places not prompted for MFA. But I get my authentication, I respond to that, and then I shouldn't see an MFA prompt again. Even if I go back onto a trusted network, it's not going to prompt me to take my MFA away. And then I go back to a non-trusted network. It's not going to ask me for MFA again because my token contains information saying I did do an MFA approval earlier. Okay. We should also give, of course, our users end user training. It's very important for our user to know what's going on and when they should expect to see an authentication prompt. And so again, to try and help reduce phishing. Branding can help there as well, although there are phishing attempts that will steal your branding and make use of that. Okay. So how do we build all this? And this is what we're going to finish our next 10 or 15 minutes to the end of the session. And we're going to just step through some screens in Azure Active Directory and look at the configuration that we've talked about here. Okay, so let's just pop over to my browser. So you should all be able to see my browser on the screen, and I've got a number of tabs open. So I'm just going to flip through some tabs and talk about what's available from the user perspective, so from the admin perspective to the user. Okay, I've got a picture. There we go. So here's a login page. You'll be familiar with these. You'll have seen these before. I took a screenshot of this earlier this morning. What I want to point out to you on this one is connected to Windows is mentioned in this. This is a hybrid joined machine. And so I've got actually quite a few connected to Windows on my computer. So I could pick any of these accounts that I've grayed out and log in with them. Okay, and this is the account I'm signed in here, which is my admin account. But I could click connected to Windows and I would sign in with that account into the browser. I don't need to enter my password for that because I've already done my password. I've signed into Windows. Okay? So that's a trusted device model. And pop back over to Azure Active Directory. And so if I was to go and look in the devices, I would see my device, and my device will be listed as a hybrid joined device. Okay, so we can see, in this case, I don't actually have AD, so it won't be a hybrid joined, but it's a device joined. That's not me, that's someone else, but a joined device. Okay, and then that means that I can sign into Windows with my Azure Active Directory credentials. And once I sign into Windows with my Azure Active Directory credentials, I can sign in via the trusted browsers. Now, this is New Edge, and so that will sign me in automatically in the background. If I was using Chrome, there's an add-in called Windows 10 Accounts that I can roll out to make this work in Chrome as well. Okay. From the user's perspective in this, I can have a look at the Users tab in Azure Active Directory, and I can do things like, let's search for me, and I can do things like, okay, well, when did I last sign in? Did I have any sign-in errors? I can look at my sign-in activity, for example, and I can see when I last signed in, did I have any failures? Was I interrupted? Interrupted means I was presented with a login page or I was presented with a registration page. And I can click on that information and find out more about it. And I can see the various conditional access rules that apply to me or so on. I'm on a trusted network, so I'm not getting prompted for MFA where I am here. Zero Trust would argue that I should be. Okay. A couple of new things have turned up in the last couple of days. I can enter things like my alternate email information, my phone number and stuff like that. I've got a new authentication experience. The administrator can submit this information in advance for the user before the user signs up. So the user doesn't even have to register for MFA anymore. We can do phone-based SMS, although we know that's not recommended. We can do phone-based and SMS-based registration. And we can present that to the user so that they get a text on first login, and then we can ask them to register an Authenticator app, but we can do MFA right from the word go because we can provide this information for them before they even sign in. Okay. Let's go back to my directory. Okay. I've got information like enterprise applications. Let's look over here. I've got a tab open for enterprise applications, and enterprise applications are the apps that are open for me. They're the apps that are signed in as third-party apps into Azure Active Directory, and I can look at things like single sign into those and other settings. A very important one that we should look at here is things like consent. Now, consent turns up in two places. It's in the middle of changing, and it used to be under user settings, and there used to be one option up here. Okay, but in the last couple of months, and indeed in the last couple of days, consent has changed quite a lot. The idea of consent, let's pop over to this tab, is that a user wants to use an application and wants the application to sign in on their behalf. The application gets a whole bunch of rights over my data or over my account when this happens, and it keeps that. It's part of the OAuth process. And so I need to give permission to the application that it can do this on my behalf, even while I'm not logged into the application. And so here's an example of an application that would like to read my email, have full access to my files, sign me in, okay? And as it does all this, maintain access to the data, so offline access to the data. Okay? Microsoft made some changes to this recently. This blue tick's the important thing here. And the blue tick is a verified publisher. That's a process Microsoft have for proving that the authenticator, the person doing the request, is a trusted endpoint. Because there was a risk, or there is a risk, with an unverified application stealing your data. Okay. And so in the last couple of days, Microsoft have changed, or I think it was November the 8th, Microsoft have changed the process so that if you haven't got a verified publisher, then consent dialog boxes won't appear, and only the admin can approve them. Okay. And so we've got consent and permissions. Okay. And what we can do is we can allow consent. Okay. So I can say any app, any permission, we can allow that. That's a really bad idea. Okay, that was the default, but that's a really bad idea. Okay, we can say do not allow consent. Users can't approve consent, and you may think that's a good idea. And what the dialog box I've just shown you here is the idea is that if it's from a verified publisher and it's for selected permissions, I'm going to let consent happen. But if it's for any greater permissions than those limited permissions, then either I don't get consent or I have to ask the admin for it. Okay. And so I can define some low access, some permissions I consider low impact. If I click on this link, for example, I've said in this particular example that if I have read access, it says read write access to the calendar. I wonder why that's on there. Wouldn't necessarily have that one. But in terms of limited permissions, there's a couple of things like I can read your profile, I can get offline access to your account, I can sign you in, okay? And they are considered limited permissions. And if I go back to consent, it would say 5 permissions set here. Okay? And so I can allow users to sign into verified apps without administrator interaction. But it allows me to do, let's pop back over here, it allows me to have this option whereby the administrator is not involved in the consent verification. Let's pop back to user settings. And in user settings, I can say admin can request admin. Okay? I can pick the admins I want to have the consent for, and I can have them receive an email, and I can have consent for 30 days. I can pick a time. Okay? And so administrator gets an email, and the administrator checks whether the application is a good application and approves it for the user. Okay? And all that's available, and then the user can make use of the application because the administrator has allowed that user to have application, to have consent to that application. Further security options that are available to me are things like we've mentioned earlier, conditional access. So I can set rules up. So for example, let's pick one here. I can block legacy authentication. There's one that's reading the descriptions, and I can go in and configure what they do. I could require MFA for admin accounts. I could require, what have we got? I could say when you're on a trusted location, your network session is persisted. The cookie will remain, or the session will remain, even though I've gone and closed the browser, restarted the machine, I come back, I open the browser, and I just carry on. I'm not presented with another authentication request. So I can do things like persist sessions, or equally, I could say, right, you can't have a session. It can't persist the session, rather, you've restarted the computer, I want you to log in again. Considering what we had earlier, which was like always the repeat of the password, on a trusted machine or on a trusted network, maybe not persisting the session might be a good idea. Right? In terms of conditional access, I've got the idea of named locations, where I can set various offices and locations and say that they are trusted. And then back in my conditional access rules, I can say things like, well, if you're on a trusted network, I think that's a good place to be, and I accept your login session from there, for example. Or there's certain networks I may say, well, okay, if you're coming from a certain country, we don't have any customers out there, we don't have any business out there, we would block connectivity from that country. There's options for that available there as well. From the user perspective as well, I've got the idea of identity protection. This is where I can take the identity of the user, and rather than having them register for MFA the first time that I want them to register for MFA, I can get them to register for MFA in advance. Okay? So I've got the ability to pre-register, and these are in the identity protection process. And this is an Azure AD P2 license. Or if you've got no conditional access policies at all, enabling secure default, security defaults rather, it gives me a 14-day registration window. Okay? And so I can see things like, for example, users who are at risk. Let's look at the at-risk report. Hopefully there's nobody on there. There is sales accounts at risk for some reason. Various other accounts are at various levels of at risk. Okay, I think these have been resolved, but we should come back in here and clear up this particular report, because I think that's been resolved. It was resolved yesterday, and there'll be some reason in the login as to why that account was considered risky. And if I had a conditional access rule that says, well, if it's a risky account, I'm going to block access to it. And then risk sign-ins, risk detections, these are reports that allow me to work out what's going on, why the risk is happening, and so on. And last one for us as a user, how the admin builds it and looks after it, is some reporting on the insights and what's available to me in this scenario. So here's the usage and insights report. Now this is available at the bottom of the Azure AD portal. So you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the Azure AD portal, and you can light up usage and insights. And here we've got application activity. And the application activity list shows me all the different applications, and I've already sorted this before the session started by failed sign-ins. So I can see, for example, that the application that has the most failed sign-ins is Exchange Online, and I'm getting a 68% sign-in success to Exchange Online. Now, Exchange Online is a target for hackers and attackers and a whole bunch of other things. So I often expect Exchange Online to have a lower success rate than I might expect, but I should be looking for lots of applications other than that in the high 90s for a success rate, given a sensible amount of logins. Obviously, if we don't have very many logins and a failure rate, I'm going to have lower numbers. Okay, like Outlook Mobile, there are not so many users in the time period. Not so many failures, but it drops the percentage down. So consider the percentage in respect to the number of sign-ins. But I can have a look at things like, let's go back to the Exchange Online one, and I can have a look at the detailed report as to when the success and failures were. And we look, for example, going back a month, there's been no failures on Exchange Online in the last week and a half on this tenant, but there was a considerable number before that, okay, 30 or 40 a day. Were we the subject of a password attack? Possibly. It's going on all the time. Okay, and there's the various errors that were going on. Okay, and this information is available to us, and we can look at this information. We can export it to Seams and other information like Azure Sentinel as well, and get much better reports. But from a very basic, if you've never looked at this, this is a good place to start. Okay, and so all this information is available to us in Azure AD. You can turn it all on from an administrator perspective, but the general idea of the various things that I had for you was to show you what was going on in the background, how it worked, and the steps needed to make it work. And so I thank you for your time. If you want to review the session, get your cameras out and scan the QR code. There's a link there. If I send you the slides later, I'll upload them to Drago, who's organizing this, and he can see what's going on, and you can get a copy of them from him. But if you want to review the session, that'd be great. I hope you've learned something about the way Azure Active Directory works in the background, and how you can, now that you know how it works, how you can try and avoid user type issues and things like that as well. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll go and open for questions. So you can pop them into the chat window, or you can unmute your mic and